Hello and welcome to another episode of Peace at Last, the podcast that discusses the latest scientific discoveries in psychology, explains techniques and principles from ancient spiritual traditions, and gives you the mental technology to put them into practice. You can change the way you feel and find peace at last. My name is Fabrice Nye, psychologist, coach, and spiritual explorer. If this podcast speaks to you, you may subscribe on the platform of your choice. I also invite you to share your favorite episode with some of your friends. Word of mouth is the best way to spread the word and support the podcast. If you are listening to this episode as it is aired, I would like to wish you a Happy New Year 2021. Today is the final episode of this mini-series on the 3 short, one-syllable words that we use all the time but that often wreak havoc on our lives. In the last 2 episodes, we talked about the words should and need. The word for today is want. Incidentally, as this new calendar year is starting, many of us want things to be different than they were in 2020. But first, I'd like to thank a listener who signs as RMHNRH and who left a review on iTunes. He wrote, "I love these podcasts. They are the perfect length to be both interesting and informative without overdoing it. I take away so much from these podcasts, and they help me in everyday life because they are easily understood and consumed. Thank you, Dr. Nye." Well, thank you, dear listener. I'm glad you appreciate my attempt at keeping the episodes short and concise. They can get a little dense sometime, which is not to say that I will not have longer episodes at times, perhaps if I decide to do interviews in the future. But for the most part, I prefer to keep them bite-sized. This episode today, I think, will be one of those. Today's topic is about the word want. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering why this word would create any misery, since we spent the last 2 episodes talking about how having preferences is a healthy alternative to imposing shoulds or needs upon ourselves. I'm going to present 3 reasons why we fall into some traps when we use the word want. Those reasons are, number 1, we don't really know what is best for us. Number 2, we tell ourselves that we want one thing when evidence points to the contrary. And 3, we mainly know what we don't want rather than what we do want. So let's look at the first one. We don't really know what we want. Now, research shows that we are really bad at predicting what makes us happy. For instance, we think having more choices makes us more happy, but it's just the opposite. Wanting comes from imagining a future when we'll be happier than we are now. But our imagination is a tool with several shortcomings, as Harvard professor and researcher Dan Gilbert writes in his book, Stumbling on Happiness. The first shortcoming is the same that plagues our memory and our perception. Imagination either overlooks or fabricates details. If I imagine how wonderful it would be to own a particular house on the beach, my imagination will fill my mind with images of sipping cocktails while watching the surf on the ocean, evenings barbecuing on the patio, having breakfast with my loved ones in a sun-filled kitchen. What my imagination overlooks is the added maintenance incurred by exposure to salt water. The fact that the coast may be foggy and the sunny days not as frequent as I may like, the added commute to my office that diminishes the amount of time I can actually spend in that so-called dream house. Another example where my imagination fabricates details would be imagining a date with this person I am so attracted to. I could picture us meeting for dinner at a wonderful Italian restaurant, savoring their oven-baked lasagna with a glass of Chianti. But I had conveniently forgotten that they do not take reservations and end up standing outside the restaurant trying to make my date forget the coldness of the air, and the lasagna doesn't turn out as tasty as I remembered it, and the Chianti is the price of a Dom Perignon. The second shortcoming of our imagination is that we think that our imagined future will be more like our present than it will actually be. Dan Gilbert writes this. Most of us have a tough time imagining a tomorrow that is terribly different from today, and we find it particularly difficult to imagine that we will ever think, want, or feel differently than we do now. Teenagers get tattoos because they are confident that death rocks, will always be an appealing motto. New mothers abandon promising law careers because they are confident that being home with their children will always be a rewarding job, and smokers who have just finished a cigarette are confident for at least 5 minutes that they can easily quit and that their resolve will not diminish with the nicotine in their bloodstreams. So, if you ask people to estimate how different their life will be 10 years from now, and then you ask them how different their life is today than it was 10 years ago, you will find that they don't see their life changing that much into the future, while faced with the evidence that their life now does not look much like their life a decade ago. This has to do with the empathy gap that we suffer from between us and our future self. I may think I want something that will make me happy in the future, but when the time comes, that option may not be so appealing after all. Remember Aesop's fable, The Old Man and Death. It goes like this. A weak old man had been gathering wood in the forest. He walked a long way, his back bent under a huge burden of sticks, to carry the wood to the city for sale. One day he grew so tired and hopeless that he threw down the bundle of sticks and cried out, "I cannot bear this life any longer. Death, come and take my troubles away." To his surprise, Death immediately appeared in answer to his call and asked for what reason he had called him. Terrified by the apparition of the Grim Reaper, the old man stammered and replied hurriedly, "Well, sir, I just needed some help putting back on my shoulders this bundle of sticks which I had let fall to the ground." Finally, the third shortcoming of our imagination is that it fails to see that things will feel different once they actually happen. We want the cookie, we want the car, we want the job, and when we get it, it's rather anticlimactic. We're satisfied, briefly, but then we want more and more and more. This is what is called the hedonic treadmill. In his book, Buddha's Brain, psychologist and meditation teacher Rick Hanson writes, "When you do fulfill a desire, the rewards that follow are often not that great. They're okay, but look closely at your experience. Is the cookie really that tasty, especially after the third bite? Was the satisfaction of the good job review that intense or long-lasting?" So I would recommend to anyone who has been listening to my podcast that they buy and read this book, Buddha's Brain. It will give you a very complete overview of the reasons why our brain itself is an obstacle to our own happiness, and some ways to overcome it. But even beyond the limitations of our brain and our imagination, sometimes we just don't know what we really want. This is especially true when we want someone to do something or behave in a certain way. Let's say I want my kid to go to college, but he doesn't seem to want to. I'm all upset because I imagine him flipping burgers and living a mediocre life. But can I really know what is best for someone else's path? Can I even really know what's best for my path? There's a Taoist story that illustrates this. It talks about an old farmer who went through a series of events that may seem either positive or negative at first sight. There lived an old farmer who had worked in his fields for many, many years. One day, his horse bolted away. His neighbors dropped in to commiserate with him. "Your stallion ran away, what terrible luck!" To which the farmer only replied, "Maybe so, maybe not. We'll see." A few days later, the horse returned home, leading a few wild mares back to the farm. The villagers shouted out, "Your horse has returned and brought several horses home with him. What great luck!" The farmer replied, "Maybe so, maybe not. We'll see." Later that week, the farmer's son was trying to mount one of the mares, and she threw him to the ground, breaking his leg. Once more, the neighbors came by to express their sympathies. "Your son broke his leg. What terrible luck!" The farmer replied politely, "Maybe so, maybe not. We'll see." A few weeks later, soldiers from the emperor's army marched through town, recruiting all the able-bodied boys for the army. They passed over the farmer's son thanks to his broken leg. The neighbors patted the farmer on his back. How lucky he was to not have his son join the army. Again, to which the farmer replied, "Maybe so, maybe not. We'll see." This parable simply points out that what seems like a good thing may not be one, or what seems like a bad thing may not be one either. In fact, it brings into question whether there is any merit in labeling a situation good or bad. The second reason why we fall into some thinking traps when we use the word want is that we fool ourselves into thinking we want one thing when we really want another. This one may not be obvious at first. You may have seen cars in the street with a license plate frame or a bumper sticker that says something like, "I'd rather be golfing." And you can insert there the activity of your choice: hiking, biking, fishing, flying, bodybuilding, barrel racing. But if that's true, that this driver would rather be at the gym, at the airport, or in the mountains than stuck in traffic on their way to the office, then begs the question, why aren't they? If you are sitting in a boring meeting and you are waiting instead to take an early lunch, and you are observing that although nobody has chained you to your seat, you're still not getting up and walking out the door, this means that what you want is indeed to be sitting in this boring meeting. What we miss in such cases is that we conduct internally a cost-benefit analysis that goes something like this. My stomach is grumbling and I'm about to fall asleep. It would feel so good to take a stroll down to the food truck and go sit in the park to eat my lunch. But if I do that, my boss is going to be mad at me. My colleagues will judge me to be a slacker. I may get a bad review this month, and I might even get fired in the end. All things considered, it would be best for me to endure this meeting and take my lunch when it's over. This cost-benefit analysis takes place in a fraction of a second, probably even subconsciously. The truth is, you are making a choice, and that choice is obvious when you know how to see it. Look at what you're doing and you'll know exactly what it is you want. It's only because we are telling ourselves a lie in those moments that we experience some stress. Now, the automatic cost-benefit analysis that happens in our subconscious might not turn out the same way if we made it fully conscious. Let's say I have some resentment toward my partner because of something they did or they didn't do. I believe I want to resolve the issue and I feel unsettled because of it. But if I pay attention to my actions, I notice that I am not saying anything and I'm not bringing up the issue that is bothering me. You see the contradiction between what I think I want, i.e. resolving the issue, and what is really happening, me saying nothing. This is the result of yet another cost-benefit analysis that may sound like this. I would like to talk it out, but if I say something, he's going to get upset, and that's going to ruin the whole day. Might not even solve the problem. I'd rather stay with the status quo for now. But let's say I bring this cost-benefit analysis up to the conscious level. I might begin to realize that repressing my anger and resentment is an assault to my own integrity. That whether or not my partner gets upset is their business, not mine. That I'm falling into the thinking trap of mind reading and fortune telling, and that they may be willing to discuss the matter in a mature adult way. If I go through this internal process, I might just find out that I choose to bring it up to my partner after all. That's when I know that I do want it. One reason why you may experience this contradiction is the fact that the you who wants something is not the same you who chooses not to have it. We are made up of multiple selves who take front stage at different times. If you have listened to my episode 7, What is Enlightenment?, you already have an inkling that identify with one single consistent self is a flawed assumption. It is more accurate to see ourselves as a collection of selves, or as a symphony of selves, my professor Jim Fadiman would say. Also think of it as a bunch of parts. Do you sometimes hear yourself say, Well, part of me would like to punch him in the face, but the better part of me knows that it wouldn't be a good idea. What are these parts we're talking about? Well, they are the different voices talking to us in our heads. I hope we can go over this topic at greater length in a future episode. But for now, let's say that the part who wins is the one who determines what we really want. A third and final reason why we get confused or bent out of shape when we use the word want is that we are often better able to know what we don't want than what we do want. This is pretty common. We find ourselves in an uncomfortable situation, a situation that provokes some discontent in us, and we try to push it away. For instance, I'm not happy in my job, but I'm not sure what I want to replace it with. I don't like the partner I'm with because they're moody, clueless, and insensitive. I know I don't want someone like that, but I'd be hard-pressed to describe the person I really want to be with. You might think that it's important to know what you don't want, and it is. But knowing what it is that you want will make it more likely for you to get it. You see, if you move away from what you don't want, the number of paths or directions to take is nearly infinite. It's like, fleeing away from one center and going in all directions. All you know is you escape a specific situation, but that doesn't give you a specific destination. Whereas if you know where you want to go, the path to get there will be clearer. This third reason has less to do with the way we talk to ourselves and more to do with the usefulness of knowing not only what you don't want, but more importantly, what you do want. To summarize, the three reasons why we fall into some traps when we use the word want are: number one, we don't always know what is best for us in the long run. Number two, we tell ourselves that we want one thing, but what we do shows we really want something else. Number three, we mainly know what we don't want rather than what we do want. So there isn't a specific practice around the word want today because using the word want is not automatically distorted. The only thing required is that when you hear yourself say, I want, if the resulting emotion is an unpleasant one, you may want to question whether or not you really want what you say you want. This concludes this episode of Peace at Last. For more information, go to peaceatlast.us, where you'll find the show notes for this episode. If you have comments or questions, leave them on the website, or you can email me directly at fabrice@life.net. I may be selecting your question as a topic for a future episode. I also invite you to contact me if you would like some personalized help in applying the principles I describe here. If you just discovered this podcast, you can subscribe on iTunes or on the platform of your choice. If you like this podcast and you want to support it, tell a friend who may not be familiar with podcasting and show them how to subscribe. Another way to support it is to go to iTunes and leave a review. It will help other people discover this podcast. I am Dr. Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join me next time for another episode of Peace at Last.